Welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we are joined by Chris Ranalli, who is at the Free University of Amsterdam. Chris, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Yeah, sure. So the thought experiment is maybe not much of an experiment for most people because it's just involves you being at a zoo and imagining that you are looking at what you take to be a zebra enclosure. So you're sort of looking at the horse-shaped animals with black and white stripes, and intuitively you believe that there's some zebras there, right? So that's what your visual experience suggests. The trouble is that, you can kind of imagine, suppose your friend is a bit, I don't know, kind of likes to push you, like, get you to think and says, like, well, how do you know that those aren't cleverly disguised mules? And so the thought is that you don't know that they're not cleverly disguised mules. I mean, after all, you haven't, done any special checks. You haven't really gotten close up to them. It's hard to see how just standing in front of the enclosure, you can just tell or just see that they're not cleverly disguised mules. But on the other hand, it seems like you do know that they're zebras. Um, but here's the thing: those two also seem incompatible, right? So if the animal that you see really is a zebra, that entails that it's not a cleverly disguised mule. So it looks like we actually have a kind of paradox here, an inconsistent triad. So, it seems like you know that the animal is a zebra, but you don't know that it's not a cleverly disguised mule. But if you do know that it's a zebra, then it seems like you should be in a position to know that it's not a cleverly disguised mule. So it looks like they can't all be true together. Yeah, so the question is this is just like sort of a pretty straightforward case of someone raising what epistemologists call a skeptical hypothesis, which is a kind of error possibility, which is incompatible with what you take yourself to know. And then so you can kind of do this for lots of different beliefs. So I could say, how do you know right now that you're sitting there listening to me? This could all just be a pre-recording, right? Or you could be, asleep in your bed dreaming right now. So that's what a skeptical hypothesis is like, and the trick is to see, well, how can you take yourself to know what you think you know if you can't rule out these sorts of hypotheses.
So it seems to be there's this tension between wanting to be skeptical about what we take at face value. In other words, there are certain things that are presented to us that may not be true. And we want to be able to ask the right kinds of questions to find out if they're actually true. And there's another set of things that seem so obviously true that it would be improper to be skeptical about them. So what are the kind of tools that we should be using to work out when we should be skeptical and on what we should be skeptical about?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I suppose like one thing a person could start with is just sort of like the body of common knowledge or common sense knowledge. So if someone raises an error possibility, which is just sort of immediately or obviously incompatible with common sense, that's at least some reason for being suspicious that the claim is false. And by common sense, I mean things that, well, most people sort of like reasonably take for granted. So for example, that there's physical objects, or that there's other people in the world, or that things don't sort of just vanish mysteriously. So it seems reasonable just to presume that, if someone raises an error possibility incompatible with common sense, then you ought to be suspicious of it. Another one would be if the error possibility they raise is sort of like morally controversial, right? So something like, I mean, well, to say the least, but like something like a Holocaust denialist like scenario, right? I mean, in that sort of case, there's sort of like a moral risk of being wrong, right? So if you were to take that hypothesis seriously and really start to inquire and investigate into it, you'd sort of run the risk of morally wronging certain people, namely Jewish people. So among others. So I would say, thinking about whether the hypothesis puts pressure on common sense, and also whether the hypothesis is sort of morally controversial or morally suspect. Yeah.
So that's very interesting. I've never thought about that as a requirement on whether we should doubt skepticism, whether that skepticism has a moral component. I mean, when you use the Holocaust case, when you raise a Holocaust case, that's quite obvious. It seems like the burden of proof on the skeptic is much higher because of the moral component. But at the same time, it seems like we don't want morality to play a role in what's true. So how do you reconcile those?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So the thought here is not that if the claim is morally suspicious, or if it poses a moral risk, then it's likely to be false. It's more like thinking about which alternatives should we consider seriously, right? So now we're kind of considering the requirements on being a kind of rational or at least a reasonable agent, and that's something that's really important to at least most people. So the thought is like, well, I don't really need to consider all possibilities of error in order for me and my beliefs to be reasonable. I just need to consider, well, a certain subset of those possibilities. So when you consider the Holocaust denialist hypothesis seriously, you're well, I mean, not only are you being morally risky, but you're sort of opening yourself up to having to consider many more possibilities of error, right? So it won't be just that one, but now it'll be other types of conspiratorial hypotheses, other even deeper, more systematic ways of being in error. So you're sort of jeopardizing your rational agency in general. So there is some pressure on your rationality there, because now you'll have to consider all these different scenarios seriously, and we sort of just need some kind of rule of thumb or some sort of test for considering hypotheses seriously. And so the moral test it's not really a test which delineates the true hypotheses from the false hypotheses. It's a test which delineates what you should consider seriously and what you shouldn't consider seriously.
So does that rule out conspiracy theories generally as the sort of theories that we should take seriously?
No, actually. So I think it's sort of helpful here to distinguish between, at least starting off, so two types of conspiracy theories, or conspiracy hypotheses rather. So one is sort of really local. So it could be something like, maybe your local city mayor is so the hypothesis is that your mayor is bribing the local media to sort of publish bad reports on his or her competitors, right? So that's a conspiracy hypothesis, a political one. And that's an instance of a local conspiracy hypothesis. So it just involves a really small subset of actors, and it involves just one single event. However, there's also sort of global conspiracy hypotheses. So this would be something like the Illuminati conspiracy theory. So according to that theory, or that hypothesis, there's a group of actors conspiring, and these actors are apparently either like nefarious aliens, or they're nefarious rich people, or maybe even I've read some Illuminati conspiracy theorists think of them as sort of influenced by like demons or something like that. And so they're sort of orchestrating every major political event worldwide. So their hands are kind of not just in, the sort of in the mayor's affairs, but in all the different prime ministers and presidents across the world, wars, major business mergers, and so on and so forth. When it comes to local conspiracy theories, rationality really requires you to inquire and investigate whether that hypothesis holds or not. And that's the sort of thing investigative journalists actually try to do. But when you think about these more general, global conspiracy hypotheses, it seems to me that there's sort of a rational presumption that they're probably false, right? So you don't really need to undertake investigation or inquiry to sort of like get evidence to believe that it's false. Rather, it's permissible for you just to rely on common knowledge and common sense and say like, well, look, I mean, if that were true, then I wouldn't, then, all these things I know would actually be false, right? Like, so for example, if the Illuminati conspiracy hypothesis were true, then it would be false that I know that Joe Biden was democratically elected to be the most recent president of the United States, right? Because according to the Illuminati conspiracy theory, the Illuminati actually undemocratically orchestrated such an event, right? So I would just say it just depends on what type of conspiracy theory it is, whether it's one of these more local ones or whether it's a global conspiracy theory.
So I wonder if we can capture this in two ways. The one is to say that he who alleges must prove, and the other one is that the bigger of a deal it is, the allegation that you're making, the more evidence you need. So if you're saying something, very small scale, like, I think the mayor might be involved in corrupt activities, well, then we require a certain amount of evidence, and the person who alleges it must still prove it, but they don't need enormous amounts of evidence. If you make the claim that there are interdimensional beings who are controlling the whole of reality, that seems like such an extraordinary claim. As you said, it would be the kind of thing that would make so many other things false, that the amount of evidence we need to take it seriously needs to be in proportion to that. So I wonder if that's the kind of principle that we can use to adjudicate, what are the kind of things that we should believe in. The other thing that I want to touch on is this question around the morality of the claim. So it seems like, as you say, in the Holocaust denier case, one way to explain that is without reference to morality, to say, well, we have all of these personal accounts of people that survived the Holocaust. We have all of these historical records. We've got so much going for the hypothesis that there was a Holocaust that led to 6 million Jews being exterminated. And on the other hand, you have a very paltry amount of evidence from the deniers. And it seems that they have an evidence problem, and their disbelief in it is also immoral. In other words, because there was so much suffering during the Holocaust. But I wonder about this case where, let's say we think about someone being accused of a heinous crime, and we want to make a denial of that. Well, it would seem that our denial of the heinous crime, if we take morality into account, becomes more of a problem depending on how serious the offense was. So if someone was accused of murdering one child or murdering 1,000 children, the 1,000 children case seems that much worse, and therefore it seems more immoral to deny it. But there's a tension with that in my prior claim about there being, he who alleges must prove, and the more fantastical claim, the greater the amount of evidence. So to my mind, when someone alleges that someone has committed a really dastardly act, and denying it would seem dastardly in and of itself, we might still think, well, hold on, this is a big claim, and I ought to weigh in the evidence before I accept it to be true.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting case. And so it'll depend. So, I mean, actually, a lot of epistemologists, perhaps strikingly, think that, the requirements of morality tend to dominate. So if you are at risk of morally wronging someone by undertaking some kind of act, even if that's a certain type of inquiry, or even if that means forming a certain belief state, if you're at risk of morally wronging someone by doing that, then it's better to try to avoid the moral wrongness, even if that means risking your rationality. However, some epistemologists are more on the sort of epistemic side, and they say, like, well, you should really, I mean, rational agency is really what counts. So if there's ever, well, typically when there's such a conflict, you really ought to go in favor of the direction of being a rational agent, which will mean respecting and following the evidence wherever it leads. Yeah, so we have this principle, the sort of like the bigger the claim, then the more evidence you need in order to rationally believe it. On the other hand, though, if you were to disbelieve it, you do something morally wrong. Then I guess I would sort of lean more towards the view that you should perhaps go towards getting the evidence then, because disbelieving it, then you do something immoral. So this is still sort of in line with the idea that morality, not that it necessarily dominates, but that it typically dominates.
So if we think about how we deal with criminal suspects, we take the view that you should presume that they are innocent and that the state bears an onus in proving their guilt. And that especially in very serious cases, we want an enormous amount of evidence because there's consequences for that person. So what you have here is there's a moral schism because there's the rights of the accused and there's the rights of the victims. And it seems strange to me that the more alleged victims I add in, that should change my belief states. So in other words, let's say there's one murder victim and one person who's going to get sentenced to death for doing it. You say, okay, well, the moral stakes are equivalent. And so that's, I should let the evidence guide me. But once I start to throw more and more alleged victims into the case, you say, well, there's so many victims at stake here. There's so much more moral reason to believe their story. Therefore, I ought to believe that this person is guilty. As opposed to, as I say, he who alleges must prove, and what you're alleging here is, this person has committed some kind of genocide, and you need all that evidence for it. So, I mean, this kind of might play out in a couple of ways that are contemporary, one of which might be something like Me Too allegations. So, if you think about a slogan like Believe All Women, you have a situation where people say, you must believe the case. It is a serious case of some kind of sexual impropriety, and any denial from the accused should be scuffed off because it must be by nature an immoral denial, and no good person will ever make a false allegation. And then you wind up in interesting situations where you have conflicting stories from two women. So there's been an HBO series that's come out on Woody Allen and Mia Farrow, and there is a conflict between Mia Farrow and Woody Allen's wife, Sun Yi. Sun Yi was raised by Mia Farrow. And they both have very different accounts of what Mia Farrow was like as a mother. Sun Yi makes allegations that she was an abusive mother, while Mia denies it. So your sort of slogan of Believe a Woman doesn't work because you've got a contradiction between the two women, and you've got a case where there's some moral impropriety that goes either way. So yeah, I wonder if the principles are doing the correct amount of work in this case, or whether our moral principle is really confusing matters of truth. I want to just sort of make it a little harder for you. So
I was going to make it easier.
No, I want to turn on the screws first, then I'll let Jason make it easy. What the move you've made is to sort of adjust between the moral and the evidence route. So you said, but if we're dealing with a situation where you've got thousands of surviving families testifying against this one person, well, we have very good reason to believe them. I'm not going to fight you on that. I think that's totally true because it's the evidence. Here's the two cases I want you to think about. The one is you've got one person who accuses another person of killing a child versus one person who accuses another person of killing 1,000 children. Okay. So in other words, we've got the same amount of evidence. The claim is that because the crime itself is so much worse, it's 1,000 children, the moral stakes change, and we now have greater reason to believe that this person actually performed a killing of 1,000 people than in the case where the accusation was merely one. And that is directly at odds with the earlier epistemic norm of saying, he who alleges must prove, and he who makes a great allegation must produce more evidence. In this case, what you're saying is we need a lot less evidence because the moral stakes are so much higher.
But I guess the thing I'm not following yet, though, is I mean, so I don't mean that one shouldn't, try to respect the evidence or try to follow the evidence and undertake inquiry. Rather, the thought behind this sort of like moral norm here is just that which hypotheses you consider relevant has to go through like sort of a moral filter, right? But that doesn't tell us, whether or not the claims that you're, considering are true or likely to be true. So it's not so it's not really playing that kind of role when it comes to belief. So it's not going to like fix belief. It's more just about which sorts of scenarios would it be responsible for you to consider seriously. So I would say, in the case of many different women who've never met each other, and they all come forth and say, hey, this person has been, doing offensive or sexually offensive acts or like testimony towards us. I mean, given the background knowledge that we all have that things like that sadly happen, it's not just that morally we ought to take that seriously, but also like rationally we ought to take that seriously. So then it passes through like two filters. It passes through the epistemic rationality filter, and it also passes through the moral filter, so that now it really is a consideration that we ought to take seriously. But from the fact that we ought to take it seriously isn't yet to say that there's a presumption in favor of believing each and everyone's testimony. So that's still like an additional step. That's an additional claim. And I suppose what might support that additional step would be something like a rational presumption norm for speaker testimony, right? So, absent evidence to think that the person is not telling the truth, right? So as long as there's no positive evidence which suggests that this person speaks falsely, then you are permitted to believe their testimony. That is the rational thing that you ought to do. That doesn't mean that the testimony is true. It just means that it would be rational for you to believe them. And it also doesn't mean that further evidence couldn't come forth which would undermine that belief. So it might be that, initially what you ought to do, epistemically, but also morally, is trust their testimony. It could come to light that actually they, many of them are speaking falsely, or the testimony is misleading. But still, that doesn't really put pressure on this presumption norm that thinking about what rationality requires of you. Well, it's that you ought to take the testimony at face value unless there's positive evidence that they're speaking falsely.
So I have a different solution for you, Chris. And I know it's not going to please Mark, but I think it's the solution that people are using. And the solution is to say that we're going to split this firm view that a single event has happened. So let's say, for example, in the Me Too movement, a woman comes forward and says that X harassed me. The approach to this, which I think a lot of people are taking, is to say, we immediately believe you in the sense that we think that it is rational to do so and moral to do so and immoral not to. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't question in a very serious manner and take very seriously the testimony of the accused. Because you could have an harassment that has happened without a harasser. So you could have, for example, a rape that happens without a rapist. So you could have a woman who experiences a rape and does so legitimately, and it is a real rape, and it is traumatic and horrendous. But if you question the man, there might be so many misunderstandings along the way that he is unaware that he's done anything wrong. Now, I'm not saying this is the case in all cases. I'm not saying that all rapes are like this. I'm not saying that all harassment is like this. But it seems like in our discovery and our process of discovering what is going on in the case, we can start with a presupposition like this, because what it does is it presumes the innocence of the accused, while at the same time taking the story of the victim very seriously.
Yeah, so I mean, this is all still broadly in line with the idea of when a possibility is considered relevant, is partly a function of, the sort of like the moral risk and the moral stakes. So here in this case, we have, the moral risk of harming the potential, the alleged victims, but we also have the potential moral risk of putting in jail someone who's been falsely accused, and if not that, then kind of like ruining their career and etc. So there are like two sets of moral stakes here, or two moral risks. So I guess one question is which one is weightier, right? And so I think that we probably won't be able to determine that a priori. We'll probably have to just look at cases, individually, one by one.
So I'd like to turn to a different kind of topic. So we found that there are certain institutions that people have had a lot of trust in. So if we think about mainstream media, most people felt that they could pick up their newspaper, they could read the New York Times, and they could say, I'm pretty damn sure that the stuff in here is true. And we've found that there's been a big shift in this regard. So people have become more and more skeptical about mainstream sources. And we also have the intersection of social media playing a role. So you have stories that can go quite viral. Some of those stories turn out to be false. Some of them are salacious. And then you also have social media giants like Facebook and Twitter fact-checking stories. So putting a little notice up to sort of say, you might want to look further into this. And then there's a concern about the fact-checking, that the fact-checking is not neutrally done, that there isn't a fact of the matter, that there is some ideological consideration here. So what are the tools that people ought to be using to assess what they should believe when they're consuming their media, either from alternative sources or from mainstream sources?
Well, I guess the first thing to realize is that, whether it's mainstream or alternative media, there is at least some ideological framing, right? So what I mean by that is, if you sort of like open the Guardian or the New York Times, or rather, put it, in your web browser, even the stories that get selected by them is, of course, driven by a certain ideology, namely what sorts of stories we ought to consider seriously, which ones are worthy of investigation, which ones are worthy of critical discussion. So I would say, even when it, so as consumers of mainstream media, we ought to, at least be aware that even the sources we go to routinely are still ideologically driven. But to say that something is ideologically driven is not yet to highlight any epistemological problem with it per se, because it could be that, well, they're right. That is, these stories that they are presenting to you are the ones that ought to be considered seriously. They are really the ones that are relevant with respect to gaining truth and avoiding falsity. So you could think of mainstream media as a kind of relevance filter, right? So it's kind of like filtering out the stuff that is irrelevant and likely to lead us astray or to mislead us. That's one way of thinking about it. But of course, we also know that that's not the case. So, that's, I don't mean, of course, something crazy like that mainstream media reports are mostly false. That's obviously not true. But what I mean is that certain stories, of course, will be omitted because they're not considered seriously, or because, or sorry, not because they're considered irrelevant, but just because they don't sort of fit the viewership that they're targeting, right? And from the fact that they don't fit the viewership that they're targeting, that doesn't mean that the story they're omitting is false or misleading, right? So the problem with so mainstream media, but of course also alternative media, if that's the only media you consume, is what's called coverage reliability. So basically that means, even if, whether you're sort of like a Fox News viewer or a connoisseur of The Guardian, in both cases, they're coverage unreliable. So they're just not covering, all the different sources that could be covered, all the different topics that could be covered. So in this way, they're coverage unreliable. But from coverage unreliability, it doesn't follow that what they do cover is false or misleading. So I think, yeah, it's just important to keep that distinction in mind, this kind of truth reliability versus this coverage reliability. And so, when we think about things like social media, one of the main problems with social media is this coverage reliability, and also the way in which coverage, unreliability is facilitated. So it's really facilitated based on not just my preferences, but on what the algorithms predict my preferences are or will be. And it just needn't be the case that my preferences map onto reality, right? So, I mean, I feel like this is a sort of uncontroversial truth for everyone, right? I mean, we can easily have preferences which just don't map on to the way things are, or to the way things will be. But as soon as your sort of like news feed and the kind of media that you kind of get online is really a function of your preferences or the preferences that the algorithms are estimating. Now then we're moving from coverage unreliability to potential truth unreliability, right? So I would say one of the dangers with social media over something like traditional media is that with sort of like traditional media, the main problem is something like coverage unreliability, but with social media, we also get not just coverage unreliability, but potentially truth unreliability out of that.
So I just want to make 2 points. So the one is from my capacity as an advertiser. So I run advertising on social media, and I'm very much part of the problem. So I run, some of my clients are political clients, and we run adverts on a very particular ideological stance that we drive. And one way of looking at that is that that's highly problematic. So it's going to lead to both coverage unreliability and potentially truth unreliability rather. But there's another way to think about it, which is that we are not the only ones doing it. So there's a battle of ideas happening on social media. And so each side is providing both coverage unreliability and perhaps truth unreliability. Their claims are marred by both of these aspects. But because you've got this confluence of competing advertisers and competing social media messages, it allows the consumer of social media content, to decide on what they think is the right message. So that's one way out of this problem. The second point I wanted to raise is there seems to have been this enormous push towards investigating the source of a claim. So just as you said, if you want to look at a claim, you ask whether it's made by The Guardian or Fox News. And so you see that The Guardian is more left-leaning and Fox News is more right-leaning. And you assume that that claim is rooted in some way, perhaps not assume with total certainty, but with justification, that claim is rooted in their ideological stance, and you take that from whence it comes. But that is very much against the tradition of philosophers who believe that there's a certain type of fallacy that we should avoid called an ad hominem. So an ad hominem is where you criticize the arguer instead of the argument made. And I wonder whether investigating the source of a claim is just in and of itself an ad hominem.
Right. So here, I think there's a straightforward answer, and it's no. So, I mean, think of it like this, like sort of an instrument, right? So, imagine I have, I don't know, let's say a gas, an oil gauge in my car, right? So the oil gauge, will say like this is how much oil is in the car right now when I look. Um, it would sort of be weird if someone challenged me and said like, well, I mean, right now, it says it's running low, and if I just thought it were totally irrelevant to sort of to check the actual gas, the actual uh, the actual dipstick, right, going into the oil in the car, right? So, and I think you can also think about this with perception. So if routinely, I normally trust my vision, I trust my eyesight. But if someone I trust says, well, hey, maybe, you say that that object in front of you is green, but it really just doesn't look green to me. It actually looks like a different color. And then someone else tells me, yeah, it doesn't look like the color. It doesn't look green to me either, right? It looks red. It looks red to both of us. Then it would just be really odd if I were like, well, I'm not going to question the source. I'm not going to question my vision here. So if we think it's sort of if we think it's sort of impermissible for me to say something like that in response to them, then I guess I would wonder why it's impermissible in the case of like news sources. I think so. What the ad hominem fallacy is really about is that from the fact that the person says that P, right, even if you distrust this person, you can't sort of infer that not P. I mean, and likewise, from the fact that you trust the person, from the fact that they said that P, you can't infer that P is true. And what I mean here is something like this: there's no sort of like logical deduction from A said that P to P, and also likewise to not P. But that's still orthogonal to the issue of rational trust, right? So it could be that while it's true that just because the person I distrust said that P, that doesn't mean that P is false. It could still be rational for me, nevertheless, to withhold assent. That is, I can suspend judgment on whether P is true, right? So that's like a different matter.
So I wonder about other kinds of things where we're not talking about a thing where it's simple to go and to determine the fact of the matter. So, for example, to determine whether your eyes are faulty or not, you can go to an optician and they can tell you. I wonder about other kinds of disagreements where it seems harder for us to determine what the truth of the matter is. Wittgenstein talks about these deep disagreements, these sort of things about the nature of reality, for example, where it's so hard for us to sort of reach a consensus about it because we disagree about the fundamentals. So you can imagine disagreements between those that believe in supernatural forces and those that don't, for example. Do you think that there's a way for us to adjudicate between these kind of deep disagreements? Is there a way for us to determine what the truth is? Or do we just have to say our views are so fundamentally different that we can no longer speak to each other on this topic?
So cases like this sometimes push philosophers to become a certain kind of relativist. So not moral relativism and not truth relativism, but epistemic relativism. So the idea is that, well, if there really is someone who has different fundamental epistemic principles from you, then there's really two questions here rather than just one. So we initially take it that, the one question is well, who's being rational? Is it me or is it them? The epistemic relativist says like, well, no, there's actually two. Namely, am I being rational according to my fundamental epistemic principles? That is, do my beliefs align with those norms? And likewise, with my opponent, do their beliefs align with their epistemic norms? That is, these norms which conflict with mine. So the epistemic relativist is going to say that in those cases, it's at least possible that both people are being rational. It just depends on whether or not their attitude really is recommended by their respective epistemic principles. So that's one way to go, epistemic relativism. But I also think that there's another way to go, which is non-relativistic. So this sort of looks at whether both people are actually entitled to trust the same epistemic principles. So for example, if we go back to the person who, distrusts their sensory experience, for just about every judgment that they form, you can say like, well, look, if you do that, if you distrust perception, you're going to get few true and useful beliefs. And this is the case even if they're right? So the idea is like kind of imagine a sort of a decision kind of theoretic or a decision theoretic table where you imagine that on one side is, trust perception, and below that is to not trust perception. And then on top is like, well, perception is reliable, and beside that is perception is unreliable. Well, what's going to come out as dominant there is to trust perception. Because when you trust perception and perception is reliable, you're going to get lots of true beliefs. But when perception is unreliable and you trust it, of course, you're going to get few true beliefs. But likewise, when you don't trust perception and perception is reliable, you're going to get few true beliefs. And so too, when perception is unreliable and yet you still, don't trust perception, here too, you're just not going to form very many beliefs. And then so, de facto, you're not going to have many true beliefs either. So it seems like what survives is that you should trust perception in either case. That is, it's just the dominant outcome. So in those sorts of scenarios, I would say that you are just entitled to trust. You're just entitled to trust perception in this case.
So I think a lot of people listening to this kind of language of what we ought to do when it comes to believing something someone says, most people associate the word ought to with a moral ought. So I should believe what they say because it has some moral consequence. But you, although you do mean that sometimes, you have another sense of ought here, some sort of epistemic ought. So I ought to believe this because it is the rational thing to do. And someone's going to say to you, but what do you mean by it's the rational thing to do? Now, we've been doing in this discussion, and a big part of what you've been doing is trying to give us an account of what epistemic rationality is. But I think what they're trying to ask there is, what are the characteristics like what are the kind of criteria that such an account that you're providing needs to meet? What does it mean that you ought to believe something if we take morality out of it?
Yeah, so I would say perhaps the orthodox sort of position in epistemology is to say that what fixes what you ought to believe in the epistemic sense of what you ought to believe, that is your evidence. So the idea is something like belief aims at truth. That is, it's sort of the formal goal of belief to be true. That is, it's sort of internal to belief that it's, it's at least trying to represent things as being as they really are. Belief doesn't always fulfill that function, but that is nevertheless its proper function. That's what it really tries to do. So when we think about then the norms for belief, then we're also thinking about the norms that help us reach the goal of belief, or to help belief along its way, to help it fulfill its function. And that's where evidence seems to be the best thing, because evidence is that which indicates truth. And if the goal of belief is to represent things as they are, then the best way to fulfill your goal is to get evidence for it. So on the evidentialist view, the epistemic ought is governed by all and only your total evidence. Now, not everyone, some people think that belief is also governed by other norms. And I sort of hinted at that earlier on when I said, well, sometimes, there can be, there's a moral risk to having certain kinds of beliefs. And when there is, that puts some pressure on you to change or to maintain your doxastic state. So for example, maybe this is perhaps a really simple case, but when it comes to my own family, say, it seems like there's some moral pressure on me to believe that their lives are worth living. Like, I mean, wouldn't I do wrong by them to believe otherwise? Wouldn't I be sort of like flouting like a family duty, to do otherwise? Or think about your relationship with a close partner. So if you find yourself in a disagreement with a skeptic about, say, the meaningfulness of their life, or about whether they really love you, so perhaps they don't believe love exists, it seems to me like there's some moral risk in suspending judgment there, right? It seems like morally, it would be better if you believed it, right? That would be the right thing to do. So if you adopt that sort of idea, then you think the moral can encroach on the epistemic, at least in the following sense. It can also play a role in what you ought to believe. But that doesn't mean that it plays a role in whether your belief is likely to be true. So we just have to sort of separate that out. That is the question of what should I believe, from the question of, is my belief likely to be true? So evidence, speaks to the question, is my belief likely to be true? But from this more moralist or pragmatist point of view, in order to really fix belief, we need to broaden, we needed to broaden the set and not consider only evidence, but also the moral and pragmatic factors.
So it seems to me that there's certain kinds of beliefs that are resistance to counter evidence. So if we think about some religious belief, people say, well, I don't believe in a deity because I have good evidence for it. I believe in it because I was raised in this faith and it's a big part of my identity. I find it very comforting to believe that there is an afterlife. I don't like the idea that once I die, I will just cease to exist. So it brings me some sense of joy to believe that I will live on. Or I like that there's a compelling narrative. So, the sort of story that comes with my religious beliefs is very exciting, and it has this long history. And those are the reasons that I believe it, as opposed to evidence or aiming at the truth.
Yeah, so again, this is a sort of example where now it's not quite the case that there's something morally at stake, although I guess for some religious believers there is something morally at stake, but rather there's something with respect to your well-being or your flourishing at stake. So the idea is that by believing in the respective deity that it is, you're sort of like promoting your well-being or promoting your personal flourishing, right? So, as you said, it's sort of like more comforting, you get more joy, it's exciting, and it aligns with sort of like your, I don't know, your community's values and so forth. And then so, of course, people think, well, hang on, I mean, those sorts of factors, shouldn't fix what you ought to believe, because then, sort of you can kind of willy-nilly, make it the case that too many people are believing as they ought to believe, right? Because a lot of people do believe the things that make them happier or make them more joyful and so on. But I actually wonder, though, whether or not so whether or not what you epistemically ought to believe, and whether or not it's permissible for you to believe that, say, believe that P, or in this case that there's a deity, just because it promotes your well-being really have to be at odds? Because, you know, in epistemology, we take truth to be valuable. And there's this question about, well, what kind of value is it? I mean, so if truth is merely epistemically valuable, then that hasn't really told us, you know, in virtue of what makes it valuable. I mean, I could say something like, you know, making a move that is a checkmate in chess is chess valuable, but I haven't really given you any reason to like really desire you know, getting checkmates in chess, right? So I haven't really explained what it is about that makes it valuable. And you might have the same thought for truth. And so some epistemologists say that, well, you know, the reason why truth is valuable is not just because it is defined as the epistemically valuable, but because it actually adds to the person's well-being, or it like promotes their flourishing. That is, you couldn't really live a good life without having true beliefs. That's actually a controversial view, but it's sort of like one way of spelling out what makes truth valuable, is that it makes you eudaimonically better off. That is, it promotes your flourishing. So if you thought about it that way, then the idea that other kinds of factors that go into well-being, like your comfort and your joy and your happiness and, you know, it's being exciting and conforming to your community's values, then it needn't be so odd anymore that those sorts of factors might contribute to what you ought to believe as well. And so the reason why I say that is because when we think about, you know, what we ought to do, we're considering like, well, what are the valuable things that we want to promote? And if what ultimately makes even truth one of the things that we ought to promote is because of our flourishing, then the epistemic ought itself, you know, kind of reduces to promoting our flourishing or promoting our well-being. So I would say, so that's one way of thinking about it, but it does still skirt over, you know, the issue that, you know, obviously, you know, if I believe in sort of like the flying spaghetti monster, I mean, that just seems irrational, right? Even if it makes me well off or like really happy. And so it could be that you, again, you know, so it could be that, well, you have to think about, okay, well, which one is going to promote my flourishing more, right? So is it going to be believing truly? And in that case, that means, you know, believing that there is no such flying spaghetti monster, or is it going to be believing that there is a flying spaghetti monster? So it might be that sometimes you sacrifice truth in order to promote your well-being. But of course, like, you know, many philosophers just find that totally insane. I mean, because at least one of the goals of philosophical inquiry seems to be to get to the truth, right? I mean, no matter how bad the truth is, or how badly it makes you feel, for example.
Well, Chris, I want to say thank you very much for a lively conversation. We've covered all sorts of weird and wonderful ground, and it's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.